Okay, this is sketch number 4 or 5, I can't remember, but we are on our first week of charcoal. So if you are a studio and art student, you need to make sure that you've already watched the intro to charcoal video. That's the one that teaches you about all the different kinds of charcoal and how to use them. So if you haven't watched that first, stop this video, go back, watch the intro to charcoal. It's about 8 minutes long, and practice along with it, and then restart this video. Drawing and painting students, you can just jump right into this video because you should have already watched it, and if you didn't, go back and watch it. This sketch we are doing this week, again, I'm trying to choose objects that are easily kind of customized. So an apple is what we're going to work on. And not only are we using charcoal for the first time in a sketch, but we are working on gray paper. So that way you're forced to use the white. And beyond this week, if you don't like the gray paper, if it's not something you like using or white charcoal, you won't have to, but you should get some experience working with it. So you will need vine charcoal. You will need a extra soft black charcoal pencil. You might want a charcoal stick, and you'll need some form of white. So it could be just, a stick like this, or it could be a white pencil. And you will likely want a blending stump or two. Okay, so getting started on this apple. Again, I picked it because the shapes of apples can vary a lot. So with your vine charcoal, towards the middle of your paper, you're just going to sort of work out a lumpy, round shape. And again, it can vary. They don't have to be symmetrical. They don't have to be a perfect circle. Usually they do sort of lump down a little bit towards the top, and also kind of towards the bottom. They do tend to lump up, but that's all up to you, because apples definitely have very varied shapes. So it can be taller, it can be squattier, no big deal. Okay? And we're doing this with vine charcoal because if you do make a mistake, it wipes away very, very easily and you won't see it. If you do it with pencil, the hardness of the graphite will sometimes leave a dent in your paper, and then when you shade over it, you can see that dent line. So you want to avoid that if you can. Okay? We don't have a ton to mark out here as far as shading, but we do want to mark out where the stem comes. So the stem does not come out of the tip top because we are looking down at it. So this is actually the top of the apple right here. So again, the stem can curve, it can be long, it can be short, it can stick out really high or not. That's completely up to you. And then the stem usually comes out of some sort of indentation that's in the top of the apple, kind of curls around and then in and down. So then you're just marking out where the shadow is for that indentation. So it looks a little weird right now, but once the shading's in, it'll make a lot more sense. As far as the shading goes, pick a direction for your light source. Mine usually come from the left, so I am just going to mark out, this is called value mapping, okay, where the shadows are. So I'm just going to map out where my darkest darks are going to go. And in here will also be dark darks. You can actually shade it in with the vine if you want, just to make sure it looks good. Or you can mark it out, whatever helps you. Okay? If you want, you can also mark out where like some extreme highlights are going to be, because apples are lumpy and bumpy. They might have extreme highlights in different areas, but you can plan those and mark those out as well. Okay, so once you have it mapped out, you don't have to do a ton more. If you want to start mapping out the background, you could also do that, just where it sits on the table, and the cast shadow. And cast shadows will start anywhere where the apple touches the table, so right at the base, and they're going to go opposite the direction of your light source. So it depends on how extreme you want your, and then it's just a sort of roundish shape, and you can adjust that as you go. Okay, so again, work with what you're comfortable with. You should have practiced with all these. So this is a fairly large area, so you could go right to your stick, but too many people get carried away with coloring everything in before they blend, and then they have all this excess dust that gets out of control. So I usually will color in small sections at a time and start to spread them out, blow the excess dust off, so I don't get too carried away, because that's the biggest problem people have, is control with their charcoal. So little sections at a time. If you do have a tiny corner you're working in, it's probably better to work with a blending stump than your finger, because your fingers can only fit in such tight spaces. but work with what you're comfortable with. So I'm going to try and bounce back and forth between both just so you can see both, and maybe I'll think of little tips and stuff for both. Normally I talk about, you know, shading in the direction of your object. That's still important, but if you are using soft charcoal and if you are taking the time to smear it in and blend it, usually you lose the streakiness of the direction, so people can't tell as much if you're not shading in the proper direction. So that's something that at least is a nice feature of charcoal. One less thing to worry about. Okay, definitely stay aware, looking at all this excess dust you have, and blow it off whenever you feel like it's necessary. Okay, so I'm just getting in my darkest darks, anything that based on my picture appears to be a true black, or at least very, very close to black. Because an apple is round like a sphere, even though the light source is on this side, as the apple curls around, you are going to get a little shadow that occurs there. Okay. Use my pencil to get this little dippy area in here. And again, it can be a very irregular shape. It doesn't have to be a perfect oval, because apples have all sorts of dips and lumps and bumps. I'm sorry if you don't like this sound. Usually there's a way where you can avoid the squeakiness. Okay, so I have most of my extreme darks in. And now what I'm doing is I'm just taking my blending stump, using the charcoal that's already on it, and I'm just sort of spreading that to areas where there is significant shading but not quite as deep dark. And this is where direction will count a little more, because you're not going for a true black. You definitely can see streaks in apples. You know, when you look at them, they're very rarely a very consistent color and value. You know, they go to different kinds of reds and greens and yellows, and some is dark red, some's light red. So there should be a lot of variation in here, and there probably will be some streakiness in the texture, but it should be a controlled streakiness. So this is where you're going to watch your direction a little bit more. You can use your finger to get started if you want, because sometimes that blending stump will leave too many lines. So sometimes I like to just fill in the value. You want charcoal to cover every area. So even though we are going to have light grays and highlights that could be the color of the paper, it tends to look unfinished if you have areas that are just empty and unshaded. So I like to get a little bit of charcoal kind of spread throughout with your finger or a blending stump, whatever you're comfortable with. I'm going to go in here and make sure the stem nice and dark on the side opposite the light source. Lighter on the side of the light source. Okay. And just like a cylinder, the top is going to be a slightly different value. Okay, we can get more detail into that later. Okay. Alright. Alright, so now from here on out we're refining, and we're going to start working in some whites to get this apple having some heaviness and some depth in here. So I'm going to lightly, I'm using my stick, but you can use your pencil. I'm sort of like pulling in what will be more middles, watching my direction a little bit. Don't get carried away, because you don't want this to be true black, and this will spread. So it's just something to help fade between the black and what is gray. Okay. And things are looking funky, don't worry about it yet. We still have quite a ways to go. Hey, if at any time you don't like the shape of your apple, if it's looking too short or too tall, you can always add width or add height. You know, I'm going to it. I'm actually going to make this a tad taller. To me, it's like looking a little bit like a tomato to me as far as the shape. So I'm just going to add a little height to it. So if it looks weird, try and ask yourself what it is that looks weird. If it's the value, if it's the shading, if it's the shape. And make adjustments as you need. Just remember not to get too obsessed with any one thing. Spend a few minutes making adjustments, but then move on to something else so that you actually do finish this and don't get caught up obsessing. Okay, so I'm going to start working in some highlights. My black, I'm not done shading with black, but I am for the time being. I'm not going to obsess too much over getting all the black worked out until I have some highlights in to kind of view it against. So where the apple is the roundest is where I'm going to have the most extreme highlights. So that's usually kind of coming up the top, you know, if you were to feel the apple. It sounds weird, but it works to sort of pretend you're touching it. Okay. And of course, towards the top, assuming our light source is in the ceiling to the left. Okay. So I'm just going to start off getting some in the areas where I feel like the highlights are going to hit the strongest. I won't put as much in the areas I feel like they'll be weaker. And then go through and blend. Now watch your fingers now, because if you go in with a really black finger, it's going to ruin the integrity of some of that white. So I'm switching fingers, or you can switch to a different blending stump that's clean. Okay. I do want to blend away some of those streaks and lines, but not necessarily all of them. Switching back to my black finger. And from here on out, you're going to be bouncing back and forth between black and white, blending them together, layering one over the other until everything has a nice coat of shading. Again, you don't want any area of empty paper because that just looks unfinished. At least with a sketch like this that we're doing. There are areas, if you're working on white paper and you're not using white charcoal, then you leave your whites white. But we're working on gray to give you experience working with both. So I'm starting to get a little heaviness and depth into this apple. But I'm still going to build up. Apples are fairly shiny, so we are going to have some pretty extreme highlights. I don't know why I always cross my fingers like this. I think it helps me just put pressure on. Okay. So we're adding white not only for the highlights from the light source, but you're also going to add white for some of the just natural striations and colors that there are throughout the apple. So I am going to put some of this white over where my shadow area is going to be, just to kind of indicate that there's value changes due to the color of the apple itself, not just the highlights. So you can see I'm holding my stick differently. You can use the side of it if you want a little softer look. A little bit harder to control the placement, but okay. And this is where you start to feel like a bit of a crazy person because you're just doing the same thing over and over again. But it really is the building up of all these layers that make it look nice and finished. And the more layers you put on, I think the charcoal almost gets a little easier to control, because now instead of like working into the paper, it's sitting on top of itself. I like how that feels and looks on the paper. Pay attention if you can notice that, the difference of how the charcoal starts to feel as you get more and more layers on. Try to avoid what I have right now is I have, but it looks blurry. I'm not really working too much around the stem, because I didn't want to smear it, but you don't want that to be empty too, so you do want to go in and make sure you're giving that area some attention, pulling charcoal throughout there. You can always rework the stem if you need to. Throw a little white to define it a little more. Again, if this is too thick of a thing to work with, I do have pencils that are white charcoal. It doesn't have to be one of these sticks. you'll find what you like if you experiment enough and pay attention and maybe make some notes on what you like and what you don't like. Please do continue to push yourself. You know, at this point I could call it done because everything is shaded, but make sure you're satisfied and it's the best you can do. Don't just stop because everything's shaded in. Really go back and forth and work out. And a lot of times with all the shading, you lose some of your true blacks because they get so blended out they actually turn into like a dark gray. So try not to lose that. And anywhere you want definition and hard lines, make sure you still have it. Okay, sometimes you don't want to blend too much. So now I just redarken that area. I want to blend out a touch, but I do want to keep the integrity of that kind of dip and shape. I do want some streakiness for the striations that usually are on apples, so I am going to go back through. I'm intentionally adding some in, really light at first, until I know they're placed right and look good. Blend them in softly. You don't always have to blend them. If they look good the way they are, you don't need to overblend. Right here looks a little empty. I don't know if you can tell. There's just not as much charcoal on there. So I'm just going to add in a little bit of black, and if it's too dark, I'll layer it with some white. Make sure the whole apple gets your attention. Sometimes it looks like you're doing nothing, but you really are, so trust in the process. I do like to also throw in some kind of areas of inconsistency. Sometimes if it's too smooth it doesn't look good, so here it's starting to get light, but I'm going to like shade in a little darker for like a little divot that might be in the apple and the overall shape of it. Sometimes if things are too perfect they don't look right. So. So I'm not completely satisfied with this apple yet, but adding in the cast shadow on the background really can make a big difference. So I am going to jump into doing that now. Okay, cast shadows, remember I say this all the time, but still a lot of people are not doing it right. As much as possible, shade them horizontally and darkest immediately under it. The light does not get underneath that apple, so right where that sits on the table should be a true black. And then as you move out, let it just fade away, which is a lot easier to do, I think, with charcoal than with the graphite. So hopefully you guys appreciate that. Okay, so just sort of move out. See, my shape is a little off from what I marked out the first time. So, you know, if it looks good as you shade it and it doesn't follow your first guidelines, then that's just fine. Finger, blending stone, whatever works for you. Okay, let those outside edges be nice and fuzzy. They don't have to be crisp. Shadows can be crisp or defined, so go with what looks good. If they're fuzzy and it looks nice to you, just fading out, then let it be fuzzy. Okay, so from here on out, the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get a background thrown in. Okay, if you have spent a large amount of time on this apple, I'm not going to kill you if you don't get your background in. But it needs to look like you spent time on it, and I've gotten pretty good at being able to tell what's rushed and what's not. But the background really does make it look a lot more finished. And it doesn't take too long, especially if you're using the side of your charcoal. You can leave it rough like it sort of is there. You know, it could look like it's sitting on a rough countertop or a textured surface, so that's up to you. Okay, just use a little care when you're going around your shape, but don't leave that gap if you're afraid to get close to it. That's what your blending stump can be for. The texture or not, whatever works. I do want to make sure I sort of work that tabletop color a little bit into my shadow so they don't look like two completely separate things, because shadow is sitting on top of the table. So I probably should have done that before I did my cast shadow, but I can always relayer that shadow back on top just a little bit. 2-second edits are worth making. Okay. And shadows don't have to come out super far either. Mine's pretty tight to the apple, so okay. And then I'm just going to do a lighter gray up here. Again, I'm using the side. It is going to be a little textured, which you may like or not like, but you'll never know until you try it. You could always layer this, so if it ends up being too dark and the apple is blending in against the background, just layer some white in, or I even have some gray charcoals. Oop, I just smeared that, so watch that if you have big sleeves like me. Okay, be careful about your dirty fingertips too, touching any areas that are nicely shaded and meant to be kept smooth. Okay. So, I don't mind the textured background myself, just because it kind of adds some contrast between all that work you did on the apple. You kind of want the apple to stand out and have some emphasis. This is a little too textured for my taste, but again, these little edits don't take too long and they make a world of difference, so I definitely highly suggest you take the time to really just rework things that don't look right the first time, and don't blame yourself. It takes a couple rounds of things for them to start looking good. If your finger is not doing a good enough job of the blending, you can jump to the blending stump. Some people also like using cloths, like an old t-shirt or tissues. But you do want to do your best to get that background pulled right up to the apple so they don't look like two separate things. See how I'm getting that division there? You really want to work and get that right into it as best as you can. You can redefine the edge of your apple by redrawing it in also. So. Another thing you could try, if you haven't already started your background out, is using your vine charcoal, because it does have a little bit more of a brownish look to it. So using your vine charcoal for a background is a way that would make it a little smoother and set it apart a bit. Okay, finishing touches. I'm going to redefine the stem a little bit. Rework some of these edges now that they got blended into the background. Watch your hand. Okay, so you have that little funky little piece there, so rather than trying to erase to it, I'm just going to extend the shape right there. Sharpen that up. Okay. And again, it may make you feel a little crazy, but spend some time just blending and rubbing. It might not look like you're doing anything, but sometimes it makes a huge difference in the end. I could tweak this forever, but I do have to stop the video. I will have my final product examples on the board, on my marker chalk tray of the whiteboards as well. You can borrow my sketchbook and look at it in person to see the differences and look at things in more detail. Please do push yourselves, do your best. It's the only way to get better. Okay, good luck.